Welcome, folks. Glad to see you joining us today for our tree care series. We will be getting started in about 4 minutes, so I just want to give everybody a chance to log in. We are recording today, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel after it has been processed, which usually takes about a week for it to get up on our YouTube channel. And we will put all 3 of the classes in the series on our YouTube channel as well. And something that I will do at the end of class today is I will share the link in the chat to register for the class next Friday. That's the second part in the series on establishment and maintenance. You can chat directly to me, but you can't chat to each other. And please utilize the Q&A so that I can kind of keep track of questions as they're coming in. I may pause to answer them as we go, or I may hold them until the end of the presentation. So you do have the option to send me something directly via the chat if you'd like, or you can enter your question into the Q&A. And again, we are recording today, so the video will be available on our YouTube channel following completion of the webinar. I hope you're here for the Community Tree Care series on selection and planting. See a couple of familiar names in the audience. Hello. Okay, we still have a couple minutes. All right, and a couple people asking about accessing the presentation. Still have a couple minutes before we're going to get started, folks, but if you are just logging in here, you can go ahead and you can chat directly to me with the chat function, or you can use the Q&A. We are recording this presentation, so it will be available after the fact. Happy to see everybody joining us today. Looks like it'll be a pretty small group, that's all right. Need a little more opportunity to interact with you via the chat function. Okay. Well, I have it on my clock as noon, and so I want to go ahead and get us started so that we have plenty of time to get through the content today and have an opportunity to give you the chance to ask questions. So welcome to everyone. My name is Alyssa Vinson, and I am the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office. And today we're going to be talking about tree selection and planting, and some of the considerations for tree planting. Now, this is the first part in a 3-part series. So the next class will be next Friday, same time, and I will share the registration link in the chat here towards the end of the program. I like to start out every program I teach just giving a quick overview of who we are at Extension Some folks know us really, really well, and other folks have never heard of us at all. And so to kind of help everyone understand who we are and what we do, I just want to give this kind of quick overview. So we are a function of the land grant university system. And here in the state of Florida, there are 2 land grant universities, the University of Florida and FAMU. And we work with the University of Florida to distill the research that's conducted at the University of Florida, as well as other educational institutions throughout the world, and make that information relevant and applicable for daily life. And so our mission in doing that, in providing this science-based information to our communities, is to allow folks within our communities to then take that information and enhance the quality of life for themselves and the other folks in their community. So that's what our mission is at UF-IFAS, and we do this in a number of different ways. We have a variety of program areas in our extension office, and extension offices throughout the state have different types of program areas. I'm within our residential horticulture program area, which encompasses a few different types of programs. We have our Florida Friendly Landscaping program. I focus on sustainable landscapes, and we have the Master Gardener Volunteer Program. I also manage the Master Naturalist Program. So, you know, we have those programs within our area, but then there's also a commercial horticulture group who deals specifically with nursery growers, folks in the professional landscape industry. We have commercial livestock agents. We have folks who work with vegetable growers. We have a commercial fisheries and marine resources agent who works specifically on coastal issues. We also have an agent who focuses on family and nutrition science and working on that program to get good science-based information into the schools for kids. So you can see some of our impacts here. I'm not going to read every one to you. I do want to point out that second one, though, that $860,000 in value related to volunteer time. As I said, I'm lucky enough to manage our Master Gardener Volunteer Program here at the Extension Office. We have over 100 volunteers who donate over 10,000 hours of their time every year to providing education to the public. And so they really are the backbone for our residential horticulture program here in Manatee County, and I can't say enough about how wonderful they are. So with that, we're going to jump into our topic for today. And I wanted to create this series of classes, not just to provide kind of individual homeowners with information on maybe planting one tree in your landscape, but also to provide resources to folks who maybe live in communities where there are, maybe there have been some consistent tree issues, maybe you're in a newer development and trees are still being installed. Maybe you've had some diseases or pest problems, and you're getting ready to remove some trees and replant those trees. I really want to provide you with resources that you can use to make better decisions about what kinds of trees should go in the ground, and then how to properly plant them and care for them over their life so that we can encourage a healthy and vibrant community canopy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of trees because I think that most of us kind of inherently know how valuable trees are. You know, not only do they provide the very basic service of giving us oxygen, the very thing that we need in order to sustain life on the planet, but they also offer innumerable benefits as far as soil erosion control, stormwater infiltration, water quality, habitat. You know, we could go on and on about the benefits of trees. They cool the surrounding area, so they help mitigate issues related to urban heat island. It's very important for us to have a healthy community canopy within our urban areas and within the hinterlands and the areas beyond. And we can do a lot when we are making decisions at the beginning of the process to help encourage a healthy canopy as the tree moves forward in its life. So we're going to start with selecting an appropriate tree. How do we know that a tree is going to be right for our particular location? There are lots of different factors that we take into account when we are considering what kind of tree to select. There are above ground considerations as well as below ground considerations. The very first thing you should think about when you're thinking about what kind of a tree to put in is you're going to need to understand what hardiness zone you are in. So here in Manatee County, we tend to be in the 9 to 10 range. So some places in kind of East County can be 9A, 9B. Some places that are maybe closer to the coast might even kind of touch on 10A. So our hardiness zone is going to provide us with a basic understanding of what kind of trees can survive in our area. So in order to find that out, you can just type in USDA hardiness map, and it'll pull up a map that shows you the hardiness zone of your location. If you're not right here with us in Southwest Florida, you can find out the hardiness zone for your region. And when you are looking at a tree, it'll tell you, the information that you can find about the tree will tell you what hardiness zone that tree is capable of living in. And this is going to be based on, can the tree withstand cold temperatures? Does the tree require a certain photo period in order to reproduce successfully? So something like that. So a lot of different factors are considered there with hardiness zone, but that's going to be one of the first things that you're going to want to look at. The next thing you're going to want to consider is your light exposure. Are you wanting to put this tree in a place that is full sun, medium sun, or are there a lot of other trees around that are going to shade it out? Is it next to a building? There are some other considerations. I'll talk about that with infrastructure proximity as far as buildings. But ideally, if you are looking for something that's a full sun tree, then that tree is going to need 6 hours of sunlight over the course of a day. So you're going to want to look at your location. Okay, you've got a spot where you need to put a tree. Does it get 6 hours of sunlight every day? If so, then it's a full sun tree. Medium sun tree is going to be somewhere between 3 and 6 hours, and then a low sun tree would be, 3 at 4 or 5, kind of like that. So again, full sun, you're going to want to find a tree that can handle 6 hours of full sun. I saw a hand raised. If you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A, and I will either address it right when it pops up, or I'll save it for a good spot when we can stop and talk about it. All right. So we've talked about hardiness zone. We've talked about sun, right? What about wind? Do you live in a location that is subject to frequent high wind? Are you in an area that is sheltered from the wind? Is the tree going to be exposed potentially during a hurricane? Are you going to need to consider how strong or how resilient that tree is to hurricane force winds? Some of our folks who live out closer to the water on the island, or even just on the intercoastal there, they're going to need to consider wind a lot more than other folks, because they are going to be more susceptible to some of that storm damage. As well as wind comes salt exposure. So for those folks who live in an area near salt water, you're going to want to think about, what does that wind-borne salt, does it travel into your yard? Are you close enough that you may have that issue? Do you have saltwater infiltration into your irrigation water? If you don't know, one of the great services we offer at the Extension Office is we will actually test your water for soluble salts. So if you have irrigation water, you live near the coast, you're concerned about maybe this groundwater having some salt in it, go ahead and bring us a sample. We can tell you whether or not it's safe to irrigate your plants with it. When you have salt exposure to a tree, you're going to end up with a lot of kind of burned back twigs and leaves, a lot of damage. Some trees are much more salt tolerant than others. So you're going to want to find a tree that has some ability to withstand salt if you're in an area like that. The presence of other trees is very important. This is important for a number of reasons. First of all, for sun, right? Because if you have a kind of mature canopy and you want to plant another tree amidst that mature canopy, you're going to have limitations on the amount of light. One of the other things to consider is the possibility that it's going to be hard to get an appropriate size planting hole because you already have lots of roots around. Maybe there's not enough space for the mature height and spread of the tree that you want to plant. So considering the presence of other trees is an important kind of space limiting factor and sun limiting factor. Another really important above ground consideration is the presence of overhead wires, streetlights, signs, mailboxes, things like that. When you are kind of selecting your tree and selecting your site, you can stand in that spot and just look up, right? And when you look up, you're going to notice what is around that could potentially interact with my tree as it grows. If you really want to plant a tree in an area that does have overhead wires, or let's say a street light or something like that, and you don't want it to interfere, then here's a really good opportunity to select a small tree. Right, selecting a small tree that maybe only gets up to 10 to 15 feet tall, and you can keep it pruned and it won't interact with those overhead wires and streetlights. If you have overhead wires, don't plant a sycamore underneath it. You're going to end up with a lot of interaction between the tree and the overhead wires, and then you end up with those poor trees that are just kind of cut into a V to accommodate those overhead wires. Think about streetlights, think about signs. You don't want the streetlights or signs to be blocked by the canopy of the tree. So make sure that you know where those things are located. This goes along too with infrastructure proximity. And I mentioned earlier that how close to a structure you're going to plant a tree is important to consider, mainly because there are some types of palms that can be planted within about 10 feet of a structure, but you're not going to want to plant an oak or a maple or a sycamore or something like that within 10 feet of a structure. That's because of the way that their roots grow, but also if you have a highly reflective surface, such as maybe like a tan stucco house, where the sunlight is going to be reflecting off of that surface, now you have increased the heat on that tree. And so you're going to need to make sure that there's a tree that's really drought tolerant, that's going to be less likely to be damaged by that reflected sunlight. Think too about things like backflow devices, proximity to sidewalks, driveways, walkways, what kinds of structures may this tree interact with as it grows? Because remember, the tree's not going to stay the size you plant it. Hopefully not. Hopefully it grows. So you want to make sure that you give it breathing space, give it that space to grow without having a headache 10 years down the road when it starts to buckle the sidewalk. So these are our above ground considerations. Next, we're going to talk about below ground considerations. So just as we need to consider the mature spread of the canopy and the height of the tree, we also need to consider what is the available space for the roots to grow. When you think about, let's take a live oak tree, for example, because it's a tree that a lot of people are familiar with. When you look at a live oak tree, the roots from that tree can travel out past the canopy drip line as much as a third of the amount of that canopy. So you can have roots that are spreading well beyond the edge of the drip line of that oak tree. And so when you're going to plant a tree in an area, you need to think about that horizontal growth restriction. You also need to think about that vertical growth restriction. And vertical growth restriction can be caused by things like soil compaction, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but also just by the type of soil that you have in your area. If you are unsure of kind of what your soil looks like, what your soil horizons might be, whether or not you have clay, you can go to the soil map online, and you're going to be able to when you look at that soil map, it's going to tell you things about whether or not you're very sandy, whether you have a little bit of clay, whether you're sandy loamy, and if you have clay, you might consider planting something that's a little bit more shallow rooting, because then you're not going to have as many issues with the tree roots having restrictions due to that clay. You can also have restrictions based on where the water table is located, right? Tree roots, for the most part, unless you're a mangrove or a cypress, don't like to be inundated by water. So when those roots hit the water table, they're going to stop growing. They don't want to grow into that water. So if you know that your water table is very close, then again, you're going to want to think about a smaller tree, maybe a palm tree, maybe a tree that isn't as deeply rooted and has more of a horizontal growth pattern. Soil compaction is a big concern in a lot of the newer developments. If you think about what happens to the land surface when an area is developed, you have a large amount of the upper layer of soil that's removed during the vegetation removal process, and then you have fill that's brought in to raise the ground up to a certain level in order to meet height requirements for building, as well as making it level. Then you have all this construction equipment driving back and forth across the surface, and you end up with a highly compacted, usually very low in organic matter soil. And this can be really difficult for trees to grow in. So when you're dealing with highly compacted soil or very wet soils, there are going to be some special planting requirements that you should think about, as well as knowing whether you have a lot of clay or loam or sand. You should also consider getting a soil test to make sure that your soil pH is in the range that's acceptable to the tree. Most trees have a pretty broad range from about 6.5 to 7.5. They kind of generally like that area there. There are some trees that can handle more acidic soil. There are some trees that can handle more basic soil. But it's a good idea to kind of get a general idea of what your soil pH is. Your soil pH is going to determine the availability of nutrients to your tree. So certain nutrients are, it's much more difficult for the tree to kind of get them out of the soil if the soil's at a certain level of pH. So that's another service that we offer here at the Extension Office. You can bring us your soil, we'll tell you what the pH is. If your soil is very basic, it is going to be difficult for you to acidify that soil for any long period of time. You can add sulfur, absolutely, and it can temporarily lower the pH of your soil, making it more acidic. But generally, this doesn't last over a long period of time. And that's because of our soil here in Florida, right? Our bedrock here in Florida is limestone. So we tend to have a more alkaline soil. So it's difficult for us to maintain that acidity unless we're in certain types of ecosystems. So beware of, what's the kind of general spread and growth habit of the roots of your tree? What is the soil pH requirement of your tree? Is the soil in your area compacted. And here, I'm going to ask you to type in the chat. Here's a little engagement piece for you. How do you tell that your soil is compacted? What can you do? Let's go ahead and type it in the chat. What do you think you could do to find out whether your soil was compacted or not? I'll pause for a second. Okay, so one person says take a soil core sample. Sure, if you don't have a coring tool. Yeah, perfect. One of the attendees says dig a hole and find out, right? And I would say don't dig just one hole. You can take your shovel, you can go around your landscape and dig your shovel down at least a foot in several places around the landscape, and you can tell when it gets hard and when it gets difficult to shovel. That's where you may have some compaction. You can also, somebody's suggesting water runoff amount. Absolutely, you can also dig a hole, pour a bucket of water into it, and wait and see how long it takes for that water to percolate through. That's going to tell you a couple of good things. It's going to tell you how sandy your soil is, how well that water is going to be able to infiltrate to the root system of your plant. It's also going to tell you if you have compaction or maybe a clay layer under there that the water cannot penetrate. So those are all good ideas. Okay, good. So we're gonna go ahead, the last below ground consideration, but it should be the first one before you dig, is knowing where your underground utilities are. It's very important for you to call, check on where those utilities are located, get them for you any kind of tree installation. And, you know I'm as guilty as the next person. If I'm just putting like a small 1 gallon plant in the ground, I usually don't call and have my yard flagged. I should, but I don't do it all the time. But for a tree, it's particularly important because generally the size of the planting hole that you're going to need to dig is quite large, and the likelihood that you're going to interact with some kind of underground utility is much higher. Question on extended release soil acidifiers. Unfortunately, due to the nature of our soil, there really aren't any options that I know of that allow you to keep the soil acidified over a long period of time without adding additional sulfur. There are going to be some slow release options, but again, you may have some like 6 to 9 month efficacy there. So really you're looking for picking the right tree for the right place rather than trying to amend the soil. It's going to be much more difficult to amend the soil than it is to just find a tree that is suited to that location. Okay. I believe the number in Manatee County, you can just call 411 and they'll direct you to who can flag your utilities for you. So the call before you dig, folks. I can put that in the chat box here at the end of the presentation. So we've talked about your site-specific requirements, right? What do we think about above ground? What do we think about below ground? But we also need to know, like, what about our tree? I want a pretty tree. Or I don't want a tree that's messy, right? So we also need to consider our tree specifications and recognizing what are my aesthetic standards, what are my maintenance standards, what am I going to be able to do versus what kind of a tree I really want. So again, think about your mature size, not just height, canopy spread, root spread as well. Think about whether or not the tree has fruit or flowers. I love bombax trees. They are gorgeous, but those flowers are super slippery. So when they fall on the ground, they can be a hazard, right? So if you're in an area that you're going to be planting a tree that people are going to be walking by really frequently, you're going to want to consider, if it has really slippery flowers that fall a certain time of year. Are you going to care whether or not there are pine needles or pine cones in your yard? Do you care about acorns or, in about February when the oak trees drop all their old leaves because they're growing all their new leaves, do you care about that? Because if you do, then you're going to want to think about what kind of a tree you're putting in that location. There are some deciduous trees that we have here in Florida. We don't have as many as you find up north, but we do have deciduous trees. Do you need a tree that has leaf cover all year round? If so, then you're probably not going to want to plant a gumbo limbo, even though they're absolutely gorgeous and more people should plant them. There is a resource available through the University of Florida that lists the different wind tolerant tree species. So when we were talking about above ground characteristics of trees and understanding whether or not you're in an area that is more prone to high wind, there are resources available that will give you a list of trees that tell you how wind tolerant those species are. So if you know that you have high wind, you can find species that can deal with that. Think about shape. Do you have enough space for a broad canopy, or are you looking for something with more of a pyramidal shape? Right? Because different tree canopies are going to have different kinds of shapes. So all of these different tree specifications are going to be something that kind of come into your decision-making process. And there are some really great resources out there for you to do this. There are different kinds of tree selector tools. There's the Florida Native Plant Society website. If you're looking specifically for native trees, it can give you some information on what types of trees will do well in certain areas. Also, Florida Friendly Landscaping, the floridayards.org website. If you go to their plant selector, you can select trees, you can select where you're at, you can select I have sandy soil, it gets very little water, it gets full sun, and it will throw up a list of trees that are well suited to your location. So there are a lot of really good databases out there that are searchable. And if you, if you need help finding any of those resources, that's what we're here for here at the Extension Office. I'm gonna pause for a second. 811, there you go. I knew it was 11 something. Thanks, Susan. So the number that you would call here in Manatee County to have your utilities flagged would be 811. Yeah, there was another statewide number that was something long that I thought didn't want to share. Okay, so at this point, we are going to break for a poll. I'm going to put a poll up. It's 5 questions. I'm going to ask you to please read them and answer them. And we'll take about 2 minutes to do this because it is 5 questions and some of them you have to think about a little bit. So you should see a poll on your screen. Go ahead and answer the questions in the poll. And as soon as I see that the majority of us have answered, I'll go ahead and close it and I'll share the responses with you and we can go over the answers. Can everybody see the poll? So far, 0 people have entered any answers in. Oh, there we go. All right, you found it. Excellent. Susan, you raised your hand. You can send me a chat if you'd like to, if you have a question or anything. Thanks, David. Thanks for catching my typo. All right, we've got 12, 13. Okay, only 4 of you haven't completed the poll yet. I don't know which 4. Yes, gumbo limbos are beautiful trees. They do really well in our area. They wouldn't like it if they got a freeze, but we're kind of at the topmost range for them. I love them. All right. I'm gonna give you 20 more seconds. We're at about 90%, so. I will share the link to our Manatee County YouTube channel in the chat at the end of the presentation so that you can have access to that. I'm sorry, Virginia. I see your question about that. I'm not sure why you can't submit. It may be the type of device you're on. I'm not sure. I'm gonna go ahead and end the polling though. And okay, I'm going to share the results so that you guys can see. So let's see here. When selecting a tree, you should consider which of the following. You can choose more than one. Good. David correctly pointed out my typo there in climbability, although I would say that for my children, climbability is very important. But yes, good. Hardiness zone, light exposure, wind, salt, soil pH, presence of other trees, proximity of buildings. Exactly. Those are the key things that you need to be looking for. So half of you said that you should adjust the pH and half of you said that you should not adjust the pH. I would say that unless you're planting like a fruit tree or something, maybe you have an existing tree and you're trying to correct a nutritional deficiency, I would say in the most part, or for the most part, you're going to want to select a tree that's appropriate for your site conditions rather than trying to amend the pH of the soil. It's tempting for us to try to control nature, but she's going to keep trying to go back to the pH it was at when you first got started. So in order to prevent yourself from having long-term maintenance headaches, really try to find a tree that's suited to your site locations rather than trying to amend your soil. Good, 6 hours, full sun tree requires 6 hours. Good. Yeah, when you are looking up, right, it's good to determine the presence of overhead wires, determine the amount of sun available. You can go outside and you can stand in an area. A good thing that you can do is you can kind of take a picture of the spot where you want to put your tree throughout the day. And you can kind of compare then the pictures to see whether or not you have any large amounts of shade during a certain time of day. Determine if it is going to rain, probably not. Glad nobody picked that one. And then really great on this last one, should all of the trees in a community be the same species? Everybody picked no, and that's great because if you have what we would call like a monoculture, right? You only have one species of tree. If you get a pest or a disease, it's gonna spread through that community, and you're going to lose all of your trees, and then you're going to be responsible for replacing all of those trees. So really looking at tree diversity is a great thing for a community to do. If you're involved with your HOA, landscape board, making decisions like that, encourage them to plant a broad diversity of trees. All right, great. Okay. I'm going to save that. We're going to move on to planting. So you've looked at all of these site characteristics. You have used a tree selector website to pick out a good species. You went to the nursery and you talked to them at length, and they've provided you with an excellent specimen that meets all of the Florida nursery grades and standards. And now you want to put the tree in the ground. So there are certain considerations when planting a tree that are going to ensure that it has a more successful life. So first, you're going to want to prepare the area where you're planting that tree. And this can take any number of steps, but let's say that you are getting ready to plant a tree and there's no irrigation nearby. You're going to either need to run some temporary irrigation or set up a system by which that tree is going to be watered during its establishment phase. So that's one of the things you should consider when you're preparing the planting bed. Do you need to remove grass or weeds from the area? It is not recommended that you have turf grass within 10 feet of the trunk of a tree. And I know that this isn't really followed all the time, but the best research we have shows that that area really should be not covered by turf grass. And there are a few reasons for this, but mainly it's because the roots don't want to be covered by turf grass. So if you take your tree and you pop it in the ground and then you let the turf grass grow up and over the roots, then they're not going to have as much interaction with oxygen as they would like. They're going to be fighting for nutrition with the turf grass. And also you're going to run into issues with maintenance, right? So you're going to mow your turf grass. If you mow directly next to your tree, you're going to increase the likelihood that you damage that tree by running into it with your mower or string trimmers. Also, you're going to potentially cause some soil compaction issues depending on whether you're using a riding mower or something like that. So removing the grass from the area that you're going to plant the tree is a really good idea. Make sure that your tree is well watered before you put it in the ground. You don't want to plant a dry plant. One of the reasons for this is that if you take a totally dry root ball and you put it into wet soil, you're not going to have a lot of that water penetrating into the root ball. And the reason for that is because sometimes when you end up with a really dry mass, it becomes actually hydrophobic. And so it becomes difficult for the water to penetrate into that area. So make sure that your root mass is nicely watered, and then you're going to prepare the root ball. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what that looks like. But some of the most important things to remember when you're preparing your root ball is that you really need to remove anything that is wrapped on that root ball. And I say this, you think that I wouldn't need to say this, but I say this because I have been to many, many, many landscapes where trees are not growing. People have called me out and said, hey, my tree's not growing. Why isn't my tree growing? I go and I look at that tree and there still is the vinyl wrapper that was used to go around the root ball. It's still around the root ball. And if you dig a little bit, you can find it under the soil. Sometimes, in some cases, I've even found the straps that were used to lower that tree into place still attached to the vinyl sticking out of the soil. So make sure that you're removing anything that has been wrapped around the root ball. With burlap, It's hard to know for certain whether or not that's a completely organic material burlap or whether there are some plastic materials in there. So I would still recommend to remove even that burlap from around the root ball, because even though it might decompose, can't be 100% certain that it is going to decompose. So take all that material off of the root ball, look at it. Try to determine whether or not you have some circling roots. Do the roots look healthy? Are they nice light brown, tan, white, or are they, you know, are they really dark? Are they mushy? You know, if you have any issues like that, you're going to want to maybe not even plant that tree if you have mushy roots, because then you could end up with some stability issues. So give that root ball a really good look over. You may need to shave the root ball. If the plant has been wrapped in burlap or vinyl or in a pot for any extended period of time, what can happen is the roots kind of get compacted and twisted around. And so you might need to take a spade and go around the edges of the root ball and just kind of shave off the outside to allow those roots to have a little bit more freedom of movement. And I'll show you a picture here in a minute that shows, you know, don't be overly concerned that you're going to hurt the tree for a long period of time. Plants are amazing. And when you cut a plant, you're telling that plant to grow. And this is the same with vegetative cutting, pruning, things like that. When you plant a cut, you're telling that, or when you cut a plant, you're telling it to grow. So when you cut the roots, you're encouraging growth in some of those areas. And then you're going to want to dig your hole. And when you dig your hole, there are certain size requirements, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So when you are preparing the root ball, you're going to want to locate the root flare. This is where the topmost root emerges from the trunk. So right here, you can all see my cursor. Right here is going to be our topmost root emerging from the trunk. This is our root flare. We do not want the root flare to be underneath the soil. We want it to be above the soil, okay? So you can see that here, the soil has been removed from on top of the root flare, and you wanna make sure that when you plant the tree in the ground, that you don't cover that up with soil or with mulch. Here, you can see an example, you can see my cursor again, an example of what's called a circling root. A circling root happens, sometimes they just happen naturally, but sometimes they happen because a plant has been in a container for a long period of time. And when you get a circling root, it could become, if left to its own devices, a girdling root. So in this picture over here, you see a girdling root. And what these do is they will actually hinder the process of the transport in the xylem and phloem of the tree. So you're actually going to be kind of choking off the nutrition and the availability of that tree to kind of move nutrients up and down with that girdling root, kind of choking it off here. So in order to avoid the girdling root, you're going to cut the circling root before you plant the tree. Here is a root ball before shaving. Like I talked about, you can just take like a nice sharp spade and go around the outside. So before and after, you can see that you took a pretty good amount off of the outside, right? Before and after shaving. And then here you can see the brand new roots. They will grow quickly back into that backfill soil following cutting, okay? When you are digging your hole, remember I said there are certain size requirements. You want your planting hole to be at least 1.5 times the width of the root ball. And this is really important so that you give those roots enough space so that they have kind of easy access to grow and stabilize. So it's a good idea to measure your root ball and then take 1.5 times the width of that root ball, and then you can dig your hole out to that size. So that's the width. For height, you want the root ball to sit about 1 to 2 inches above the surrounding soil surface. And the reason for this is because that root mass is going to settle over time. And so you really don't want it to settle and end up being planted too deeply. So you want to make sure that it's about 1 to 2 inches above the surrounding soil surface. So you just take a nice yardstick, you measure the height of your root ball, and you dig your hole to that approximate height. You may need to, add a little bit of soil into the bottom of it. When you go to put the root ball in, it sits a little too low, add a little bit of backfill soil in there. Don't go in and kind of stomp the soil down with your foot. You don't want to do this because then you're going to have areas of compacted soil and areas of loose soil. The roots are going to go where it's easy to grow. So if you compact the soil in one location and have nice, loose, fluffy soil in another location, then you're going to have some instability. And that tree is not going to be kind of sending its roots out in a symmetrical fashion. Okay. And we often get questions about fertilizer. People ask, well, shouldn't you shake some fertilizer into the hole or something like that? And the answer is no, don't put fertilizer in the planting hole. In particular, soluble fertilizers can burn roots and kill the plant, but also even if you toss some slow release fertilizer in there, it's really not worth it. You want to give that tree time to establish its root structure before you apply fertilizer. And, the fertilizer is going to be useful when the tree is trying to put on more vegetative growth. So if you over fertilize too early, you're not going to get as much of the root growth that you want, but you're going to encourage more of the vegetative growth. So again, it's a good idea to wait until 4 to 6 weeks after planting before you fertilize. You're going to set and straighten your plant. Make sure to kind of step back, take a look at it. If it needs staking, then go ahead and stake it out. There are some good recommendations on staking. Try to use materials like straps rather than metal that aren't going to abrade the surface of the tree, and make sure that you plan for removal of those stakes. Don't just stake it out and walk away. Plan for, hey, in a month, I'm going to come back and I'm going to take these stakes out. Ideally, you have found a tree that is of a good shape and structure that you don't need to stake it out. Okay. So again, before you backfill, make sure the plant is straight. It's hard to dig that soil back out and straighten it out once you've already added all the soil back in. When you backfill, you don't want to backfill with, say, potting mix, right? You don't want to have a hole that you've dug and then you fill it back in with soil from somewhere else. You want to fill back in with the removed native soil to your location. And the reason for that is because if you have roots that are growing out into this nice, light, fluffy, non-native soil matrix, and then all of a sudden it hits something that it's not used to, you're going to have roots that are like, I don't like that. And so you're going to end up with some unequal distribution of your roots. And really you want your roots to be adapted to the soil of the major surrounding area so that you have a more stable tree in the long run. So as you fill the hole, you can add water to kind of help remove air pockets, or you can just take your shovel and kind of stab it down into the soil to make sure that it's settling down. You don't want air pockets in your backfill because the roots are not going to grow there. Just like they won't grow into a big pocket of water, they're not going to grow into a big pocket of air. So, you don't want those roots to meet empty space or to meet a big, like the water table, something like that, because they're just not going to grow into there. Keep the backfill off of the top of the root ball So you don't want to put backfill on top of the root ball, cover up those roots. You really want to encourage a lot of good oxygen exchange. And again, don't compact it. Don't stamp it down. Don't run a tractor over it or something like that. So here you can see an image. Good job. You planted this nice little oak tree. You have a root flare here. Oh, look at that. We have a nice little flare at the base of the trunk. There's no soil over the top of the root ball. Good job. Right side, bad job. You can't see the root flare. You can't see the top of the root ball. You've put this soil right back over top of the root ball, and you have hidden that root flare. This is a tree that's planted way too deeply at this point, and you're going to have issues in the long run. I really like this image as just kind of a nice review. This is from the Arbor Day Foundation. They have some really good information on their website as well. Some of it's not specific enough for Florida, but the general information is really good. So remember that you want the top of the root ball to be about 1 to 2 inches above the surrounding soil. You want to refill with the same soil that you removed from the hole in the beginning. When you backfill, you don't want to compact it, but you want to make sure that you are removing those air spaces. And again, make sure that when you are backfilling, you don't cover the root flare, you don't cover the top of the root ball. We'll talk about mulch here in a minute. So when you mulch, and I encourage everyone to mulch, I encourage you to mulch everything, mulch all the things all the time. Mulch is great because it retains soil moisture. It's going to reduce the evaporative potential of our soil. It buffers soil temperatures, so it helps keep the soil a little bit cooler. It inhibits weed growth, which is great, right? We don't like pulling weeds all the time. And it can be problematic to try to use herbicide around the base of a tree because some herbicides are going to harm your tree, right? So it's good to have that mulch around where you've planted your tree so that you don't have as much difficulty in managing those weeds. It is going to improve the soil. Florida has very sandy soil, right? Tends to be really low in nutrient content. As mulch breaks down, it provides more organic matter to the soil. So that's a good thing for it to do. It protects plants from things like weed whackers, right? Or lawnmowers. If you have this nice mulched area around your tree, you're managing the weeds there, you don't have to run heavy machinery close to the tree, you're protecting it from damage to the bark. It makes it look finished, beautiful, right? I have seen the stark difference, you know, from when you plant some plants in the ground versus when you plant some plants in the ground and put some mulch there. It really does give it a nice finished look. You're also going to reduce soil erosion. There are a lot of great benefits to mulch. I can't encourage it enough. Please do use mulch. When you use mulch, we encourage folks not to utilize the inorganic mulches, things like rocks or rubber mulch, things like that. I also tend to try to steer people away from using the dyed mulches, just because you're not really sure kind of the quality of the mulch you're getting when it's been dyed, and that dye does, you know, leach into the soil eventually. And, you know, we also discourage the use of cypress mulch because you cannot know whether or not that cypress was sustainably harvested. Really, there is no sustainable harvest of cypress unless you're removing dead trees that are underwater. So what I generally recommend to folks is to look for Melaleuca mulch, or it goes under the name of Flora mulch. And Melaleuca is an invasive tree. It is harvested, chipped up, and then cured so that the seeds are no longer viable, and it makes a really, really, really great mulch. So look for Melaleuca mulch, often sold under the name Flora mulch. Okay, you get to answer some more questions now. Let me go ahead and get the second poll up and ready. Okay, There are a few more questions this time around, but there are more, they're all multiple choice or true false, okay? So here you go. We'll take a few minutes again. All right. 3 people have voted. All right, getting closer there. 11 folks. It's interesting. Trouble with entering the poll in. Okay. All right, we're almost there. We're at 83% of you have voted. We've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to end it pretty soon here. Okay, I'm ending the poll. I'm going to share the results. Okay, so most common causes of poor plant establishment or tree death, absolutely. Planting too deep, overwatering, underwatering are the 3 most common causes. Absolutely, absolutely. Ideally, the root ball should be approximately how many inches above the soil? 2 to 3. Absolutely correct. Planting hole should be approximately how wide? 1.5 times the root ball. Absolutely. Good, good. Remove the excess soil to expose. Good job on all of the above. For circling roots can lead to what? Okay, we're evenly split, and I apologize. I don't think I actually specifically said this when we were talking about mulch. The good rule of thumb for applying mulch to a newly planted tree is 2 to 3 foot diameter per inch of trunk caliper. Okay, so if you have a 2-inch tree, you should have 4 feet of mulch around that tree, 4 foot diameter circle of mulch. Is it necessary to prune trees at planting to compensate for root damage? No, absolutely not. That used to be a pretty common practice, but through a lot of research that was done, it was determined that that is not necessary. And no, you should not plant turf grass over the top of the root ball. Good job, everyone. Okay, so there's only one slide left. And this is my pitch to everyone, that it is really important to have a plan for trees. If you are in a community that has the ability to determine what kind of trees are going in the ground, who is responsible for maintaining those trees, whether or not you're going to replace them on a certain interval, if there's a problem, how money is allocated, have a plan. Get a plan, have a plan, write it down, stick to it, hold folks to it. A community tree care plan is going to save money and headaches in the future. And a lot of new developments suffer from the poor choices that are made at the beginning. So you end up with trees that are not suited to your site location, planted too close to infrastructure or houses or sidewalks. They are planted too deeply, and then they end up on this, pruning schedule that is unnecessary. So I highly recommend you seek help from professionals if you're in these planning stages, or if you're interested in creating a community tree care plan. Please reach out to me, email me. I'm happy to talk to you about that and walk you through the process. Also, talk to an arborist. Find a certified arborist. They are a wealth of knowledge. And then if you have specific questions about a tree problem in your community, this QR code on the screen, which you can scan with your phone, will take you to our online inquiry form, where you can upload a photo. So let's say that you have a tree in your neighborhood, you have a particular issue with it. You can scan this QR code. It takes you to a short poll. It's going to ask you a few questions, and you can upload a photo, and that's going to automatically get emailed to folks here at the Extension Office, our Master Gardener volunteers, or myself, to handle that issue. So please do develop a plan, stick to your plan, hold folks accountable to the plan, and then reach out for help when you need help. And with that, I just want to kind of give a pitch for our class next week. Please do join us. We're going to be talking about establishment and maintenance. So we're going to be talking about things like, how much water do you have to apply to it? How long is it going to take for the tree to get established once it's in the ground? Then we're going to talk about things like common problems you might see, as well as normal abnormalities. So things that you might think are wrong with your tree that are not wrong with your tree. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week. I'm going to stop my share so that I can answer this question and put the link to the registration in the chat box. So let me go ahead and do that. While I'm putting the link in here, the question was, what are your thoughts on rooting hormones that are commonly recommended to put in the hole prior to planting? And I would say that the University of Florida has done research on different types of rooting hormone, as well as things like mycorrhizal fungi, and they have determined that really those things are not necessary for just your general kind of tree planting. If you have a specific issue in your area, then it may be necessary, but they really didn't find any great improvement to efficacy with any of those products. And so I've shared the link to next week's class. And I will also share, as I promised, a link to our Manatee County YouTube page so that you have access to that. And again, when the videos are done processing, we will get them up on YouTube. So the first link there is the registration link for our webinar for next Friday. And the second link there is to our YouTube channel. So if you have any specific questions, I will also type in the chat box here. This is my email address. Feel free to send me an email and I can answer more specific questions. I know somebody wanted to talk about lang trees and maybe some questions about tree plans. So send me specific emails, folks, but otherwise I want to thank you for your time today and have a wonderful day.